welcome to the traditional annual Michel Halpérin annual event. My name is Professor Nadav Davidovitch. I'm the head of the School of Public Health. I'm honored to stand with you also as a former recipient of the Michel Halpérin. This was during COVID. Looks now far away. The bond between the Halpérin family and Ben-Gurion University of the Negev spans over 3 decades, encompassing a legacy of dedication and generosity. Following the footsteps of his father, Vladimir, Michel Halpérin led the Swiss associate of BGU for more than 25 years until his passing in 2014. Today, his son Lionel continues the family tradition as president of the Swiss Association and chairman of the Board of Governance Finance Committee. And our dear Esther Halpérin, who last year received an honorary doctorate, has continued the family unwavering commitments to education and social impact at BGU, funding transformative initiatives such as the Esther and Michel Halpérin Student Center at Zeboker, the Michel Halpérin Chair in Global Law and Policy, and the impactful Karen Moshe Leadership Training Program. Michel Halpérin's legacy as a fervent advocate for social justice resonates deeply within our community. His remarkable contribution as a legal luminary and political leader exemplify the values we strive to instill in our students. It is with great honor that we gather today to commemorate his enduring impact through this annual event. And this year's recipient of the Michel Halpérin Memorial Prize are my esteemed colleagues and friends, Professor Dudai from the Department of Anthropology and Sociology, and Professor Ayelet Harel from the Department of Politics and Government. I now invite Professor Dudai to come to the stage for a short talk about his research. Ron, please.
It's Purim 1992. There's a group of Jewish school children on a day trip in Jaffa. Can you not hear me? Try again? Okay. I'll do my dramatic opening again. Okay. It's Purim 1992. There's a group of Jewish school children.
Turn yours off, maybe? No.
Now? Okay. For the third time. Yes. Okay. So there's a group of Jewish school children on a day trip in Jaffa. These are the days which we now call the First Intifada. And some of them are wearing costumes. It's a carnival atmosphere of Purim. And suddenly there's a Palestinian armed with a very large knife, and he starts chasing them and attacking them with his knife. Now across the street there's a mechanic. He's fixing a car in his garage. His name is Abdel Karim Abdel Rani. He's an Israeli Arab, lives in Jaffa. And he hears the commotion, he goes out of his garage, he sees what's going on the other side of the street, he understands what's going on, and he decides to run across the street and to try to save the Jewish girls, to try to stop the attack. He literally places his body to protect them. He gets stabbed, he dies from his wounds later on. One of the school children dies as well, her name is Ilanit Ohana, but the rest of them escape, thanks to El-Rani. So this is major news the following day, and this is a dramatic story. It gives us some inspiration, some hope. It shows the possibility of courage and compassion across the dividing lines. A few months afterwards, there's a street in Tel Aviv, in Jaffa, named Abdel Rani Street. There's a ceremony. And there are many other such dramatic stories of bravery across the dividing lines. But what I want to understand is why these stories are not more well known. Because you would have thought with a story like that, everybody will know it. This will be a household name, and you'll get songs and documentaries and podcasts and the whole thing. But no, this story remained obscure The vast majority of people living here did not hear about it, okay? Now, I think these stories can counter prejudice, can help make this place a better and saner place if people would know of it, if people acknowledge the lesson. As a sociologist, I'm trying to understand why such dramatic stories are not more well known, okay? As social scientists, when we see something that doesn't meet our expectations, we think there's an interesting research there. But I also want to use this research to raise awareness of these stories, because as I said, I think they can give us some hope which we need right now. So in my research, I collected dozens and dozens of such stories from Tarpat from 1929 till the very present, with just some random illustrations. We have stories from the West Bank, we have stories from mixed cities inside Israel, we have stories from the 70s, from the 80s, from May 21. We also have stories of Jewish Israeli rescuers who saved Palestinians from attempted lynches and attacks by other Jewish Israeli citizens. And we have examples, variation of this story up to and including October 7. This is a story which I know some of you have heard of. But generally speaking, as I said, what I try to do with my research is to understand why this is not a bigger part of our collective memory. Why is it not a bigger part of public consciousness? Because I think they can have a very useful function as moral education. They can teach us to have some hope, to have some trust, to have some faith in the other. So there's a missed potential here, and I want to understand why is this the case, so potentially at least we can rectify it. So in my research, I identified a few reasons for the fact that these stories don't make a bigger impact. The first one is that we tend to think and understand events in terms of patterns, in terms of formulas. Okay? We have a limited repertoire of patterns, of stories through which we understand them. And rescuers don't fit into our current existing patterns. These are stories that disrupt our neat, simple narratives. Okay? We like to think there are good guys and bad guys, and this complicates the story. There's some bad guys from the other side. There's some good guys from our side because there are some bad guys from our side. Okay, so we don't know what to do with it. And these stories are, of course, there's no censorship. As you see, the stories are reported in the media. But the paradox here, I would like to suggest, they are extremely newsworthy, they are dramatic, but they are reported in a superficial way, so they remain ephemeral and they don't leave enough of a trace. So we have a kind of familiar cast of characters, which we expect to see of every story. We have the brave officer, the concerned mother, the alarmed passerby, the hot-blooded youth. We don't have yet the character of the rescuer. So we don't know how to process these stories. The other thing that happens is there's no continuity of coverage. Each time it's reported as an anomaly, not as part of an ongoing phenomenon. So you know when there's a terrorist attack, immediately on the evening news, you have the ex-general as a pundit in the TV studio saying, yeah, this is part of a pattern. This is just like last time. But when you have acts of rescue, you don't have people like myself invited to the TV studios to say, yeah, this is part of the pattern. Yeah, this is like a previous rescue. So each time it's reported as if it is the first time. Okay, and it doesn't affect our, it is remembered by the people involved, of course, but it doesn't become part of what we call social memory. It doesn't affect our collective consciousness, and it doesn't make it to the schools, it doesn't make it to the youth movements, and so on. A second factor is that the people involved tend to be so-called, and I don't like the term, but so-called ordinary people, okay? Mechanics, and so on. They are not political activists, they are not intellectuals, they are not sociology professors, they don't talk and write about what they've done, many of them, when we do get a glimpse into their thinking, they're saying, I've done nothing special. They themselves don't make a big deal about what they've done. They say, well, everyone would have done the same, which of course is not the case. So without that, we need external actors to make a deliberate effort so these stories will have a sustained resonance, a sustained effect. And this is my third point. Sociologists, we have a few rules we like to quote, and one of them is what is not commemorated is forgotten. So we need what we call agents of memory. We need people or groups, organizations that take it upon themselves to invest in a commemoration of a specific phenomena. We need them to take initiative, to take ownership over commemorating this issue, because otherwise, as we say, it will emerge on air for a second and then it will disappear. And we'll miss the potential of these, amidst all the horror and the violence, the positive stories that occur, we miss the potential to alter what is going on here. So with my research, I hope, among others, to bring attention to these stories, to raise awareness to them, and also to find a way to fine-tune the most effective way to tell them. Because this can give us some measure of hope and of sanity and of faith in the other, which we badly need right now. So I would like to thank the Halpérin family for the generous support. I'm sincerely honored to receive this award, and I hope this could make some impact for the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ron. I now invite Professor Ayelet Harel to the stage for a short talk about her research.
Should we try this before I start? Yeah, it's working. Shalom, everyone. When we think of a war room, one of the first associations that comes to our mind is this one. Here, I think you all remember, we see the US leadership sitting in a secure room in Washington, D.C., watching elite units capturing and killing bin Laden in 2011. A war room is a coordination center. It's a military strategic room in which decisions are being made, and it can be located either in proximity to the battlefield or at a distance. In my work, I don't deal with such distant war rooms. I look at Israeli war rooms located in actual danger zones. Israeli war rooms are in actual danger zones on the borders 500 meters from enemy territories. Not only that, so close to the other side, these rooms are being managed and operated by women. Women soldiers in the IDF are responsible of protecting the borders. They are watching the front line via monitors, and they are protecting the troops, and they are protecting the state. And I've been studying women in the military for over a decade now. And this is an experience that is really interesting because when I interview these women, I realize how they manage wars. Women are managing wars. Women are protecting men, they are protecting the state. Now, when I interview them, I hear about their experiences. So I can hear something in 2018. In the war room, you see everything. You see more than the soldiers in the field see. You see the whole picture. When the soldiers were in, they did not see the terrorists coming towards them. But I saw. I had to tell them to step back. I hear many, many narratives from the war rooms that are located both physically and mentally between the battlefield and the home front. And the women are managing it, and they're doing it professionally, and they are very, very proud in their abilities. And from the narratives, I hear in the interviews both pride, satisfactions from their roles, and strengths, and they believe in themselves and their abilities and the contribution to the society and the state. I also heard some frustrations and stories about others not listening to them. I wrote several papers and a book on this topic, and honestly, I thought I'm done. I moved on to the next research. But then, what happened is that October 7th happened. And what I need to tell you, frankly, that when I started a new documentation research with two of my colleagues, Rot Levi and Dafnat Koa, we're interviewing everyone involved. I have to know what happened that day. I need to make sure that this will never happen again. We talked yesterday about resilience. It's not only about resilience. We need to make sure that this will never happen again, that women in war rooms and women in the military and women in general would not be disregarded. And in this project of the current documentation project, we interview high-ranking officers, male and females, and we interview parents of soldiers, and we interview soldiers that have been released, soldiers that have been there at the October 7th. And what is interesting to learn is that what Israeli government failed to understand, and the IDF High Command failed to understand, Hamas understood. The war rooms are the most important place. It's the heart of the battle space. And Hamas aimed at these 5 war rooms located in the border between Israel and Gaza. And they actually managed to burn one of them completely. We didn't succeed to rescue these important soldiers. Dedicated, excellent, fantastic. They managed to be there and to do their job until the very end. So what I'm saying at the moment is that I have an ongoing project. I won the Halpérin Prize for 7 projects that I've been conducting, but I chose to present this one. It's not only about resilience. We need to learn from mistakes. We need to learn how come people did not listen to these women. How come the eyes and the ears of the country, the eyes and the ears of the military was disregarded? How come? So we need to learn about it, and we intend to write a report and to send it to policymakers, and obviously, as I'm being expected, to write a few papers and a book. And this is critical. This is critical. We heard this morning that the clip that the Hamas terrorists took from the kidnapping of these young women, these 5 women over here, will be released today afternoon. The state did not protect them, they protected us. So we need to learn how did that happen and how we'll be able to change it. As a security scholar, I try to understand the interrelation between security and gender power relations. And I think I begin to understand the picture here, and we will send a report when it will be ready, and we'll try that it will not happen again. This research is a testimony for those who were murdered, for those who are kidnapped and suffering at the moment, and for those who will conduct these roles in the future. We need to learn from our mistakes, not only to be biyachad nenatzeach, we will win together. We need to learn, we need to work hard. So I think that this is important for us as a social scientist. We try not to stay in the ivory tower. We would like that our research will be effective and will influence the society and the world. I thank the Halpérin family, I thank the committee for choosing my work, and my brilliant colleague, Ron. Thank you so much.
Wow. Thank you so much, Ayelet, and thank you again, Ron. Both your talks were very interesting and inspiring. Thank you so much. And now for the main event, a deep dive into public health in times of crisis from a historical perspective. I'm honored to invite our honorary doctorate recipient, Professor Allan Brandt, Emily Moses Kass, Professor of the History of Medicine at Harvard Medical School, to join me on stage. Wow, this is very emotional for me, Allan. As my mentor for about almost 3 decades, and now was asked to interview you in honor of your considerable personal achievements and significance. So first I want to congratulate you as an awardee of the honorary doctoral degree from Ben-Gurion University. So as we all are aware, we are now, we saw also now in extraordinary times in Israel, probably around the globe. Some people are talking, and it's part of my research, of the new normal. Many times we tend to think about public health in so-called normal times, but war and crisis bring unique challenges, sometimes even opportunities. In your work, including in your seminal work, No Magic Bullet, Social History of Venereal Disease in the United States from 1880, you showed, for example, how the First World War impacted medical and public health. But I want to ask you broadly, how is a historian, and I think this is a very crucial part of your legacy, your intellectual ideas, how as a historian you can reflect and discuss the contemporary problems, contemporary things like happening now in Israel after October 7th?
Thanks, Nadav. Before I try to answer your question, I first of all just want to thank everybody here. I realized as I was getting on stage that I now am a BGU alum. And I have to say I'm incredibly proud to be a member of this community. It's been a remarkable couple of days for me, my wife Shelley Greenfield, and to be in Israel now in a moment of crisis has been sobering and at the same time inspiring. And I just want to say one other thing about you, Nadav. We now go way back 30 years, and I've been thinking a lot in the context of the meeting this week about what is the role of universities, how do they work, how can they succeed, and of course, how can they change the world for the better. And I sort of had this realization that, you know, it's kind of it's a lineage of education and teaching, and one hopes impacting the world, and our relationship in many ways represents that. And you came to study with me at an early point in your career. I'm so incredibly proud of what you've achieved. And I know that you've had hundreds of students here at BGU, but now people around the world. And great universities are the engine of the future and of positive social change. So in moments of such fantastic duress and trauma, I find myself still going back, having spent my life in academia, with a great deal of hope. And this is what President Shamovitz said in his opening remarks, that the universities are very difficult and they're conflicted, but they're our best hope. And watching the presentations this morning, just gives me a sense of the possibility of working together, thinking together, coming up with ideas. And of course, a lot of this is future looking. But one of the things that I've found, and your question refers to this, is by looking back to the past, we can understand how societies worked, how people lived their lives, what was the technology and possibilities available to them, where they made mistakes that in retrospect, in the rearview mirror, we can see and try to understand better, what we need to do now. And I didn't expect when I started doing my work in the history of medicine, how every day, every project would actually speak to the present, with a hope about the future. So that's sort of how I got into this. I was studying the history of syphilis and gonorrhea. No one much in the years when I went to graduate school wanted to take on projects like that. It seemed there was stigma, but breaking through that stigma, I learned a lot that was, highly relevant to the AIDS pandemic and how it works in pandemics and the threats that we face. Similarly with COVID, as historians of medicine in the age of COVID, we're often asked, what did societies do in the past? What worked? What can you mandate? What will you find tremendous resistance to compulsory measures in? How do you get vaccines to people who need them? And how has that happened in the past? Why is there always so much controversy about vaccination and the idea that individuals should have autonomy, or we need to do the best thing for populations and get folks vaccinated? So all of these questions have been integrated into the way that I think both about the history of medicine, but the history of universities as well.
I remember a wonderful interview that you had on New York Times about when epidemic ends. I think this is very relevant also for today, because we are in the middle of the process, and there's a question, when this is going to end. And what I really loved in your answer about COVID, that it's probably not epidemiologists are going to decide, it's something much broader. And going back to the previous presentation and thinking about the different experts now in security, maybe it's also not their choice to end. And can you discuss a bit about these kind of processes between experts and society, and how we can reflect on that from history?
Yes, I think it's a really interesting question, because we might have said, well, when did COVID end? And of course, a number of us have had COVID in 2024, and the pandemic's not ended. And, there are threats right now of H1N1. So my notion was really, we would like to have definitive boundaries and say, the epidemic's over, we can come back out, we can live the way we did in 2019. But of course, that will never happen. So in some ways, it's been social and political. There have been political leaders that want to say, the epidemic's over, you can go back. But the reality is it's a complex socio-cultural process by which we end a pandemic. I've been thinking about pandemics and trauma. I've talked about long COVID. I'm very interested in the impact that the pandemic has had on people who continue to suffer. But it's been amazing being here this week, because, we talk a lot about trauma and the difficulties and the readjustments of going back to work post-COVID. And here in Israel, but really around the world, we've seen, a complex, terrible trauma. How have we thought about it before? What about the soldiers who came back from World War I with shell shock? And how did we try to help them, and how did we fail? So what I've found from studying the history of medicine is its broad breadth and possibility for understanding the contemporary world, and that we have the possibility through this kind of work to bring insights into the most important problems our world is trying to solve. The problems of health inequity are gigantic, And when we talk about COVID, we know that 70 or 80% of all the vaccine that was produced was in, middle and high-income countries. And it was very difficult during the course of the pandemic to get vaccines to the global south. And what does a disparity in access to care really mean when we're suffering a global pandemic? So these are the kinds of issues that you know so well. And I'm incredibly proud of your work because it has touched on so many of these issues as they're particular to Israel, but as they really resonate into the way we think about global health.
So yesterday, Professor Chaim Ames, rector, discussed also what's taking place at the universities. I think it's raising also the question of what is our role as intellectual. I know that Harvard also, you're facing quite difficult times. There are lots of anti-Israel demonstration. You probably know much better than I remember about demonstrations, during the Vietnam War, etc. So I wonder, and we need to bring also the COVID-19 that also brought lots of protests, including in Israel. So what do you think should be our role as academics? How we can engage? Can you say maybe what you think about these demonstrations right now?
Yes, well, let me, briefly reflect on this. It's been, for those of us academics in the United States, it's been a tremendously painful time to see the divisions on our campuses. And it's very difficult because one of the messages I've heard from so many of you over these last 2 or 3 days is that universities cannot be ivory towers. If they were, they'd be so much different and they'd be divorced from the problems of our time and the needs that we have to serve in the future. And, we have a long history in the United States of welcoming protest, but we don't welcome hate speech. We don't welcome anti-Semitism. And to see that mix on our campuses has been just personally for me devastating. At the same time, universities, as I said at the outset, are our best hope. So we have to think more about the processes of resolving conflict, common understanding, how to teach these issues. I just recently wrote a paper for the New England Journal of Medicine. It's one of the so-called elite journals of medicine, really, in the world. And one of the things we were asked to do, the New England Journal did something relatively brave. Many American universities are doing it now. They're examining their past, especially around issues of racism and injustice. And Harvard, as a university, it had a major set of committees in which scholars looked at our association and engagement and deep entanglement with slavery. And we wouldn't have Harvard the way it is if it wasn't for this, horrendous forced labor of slavery. And many of the philanthropists of the 19th century that we honored at that time held slaves. And how would we reckon with our past? And this is one of the greatest challenges for us. So the New England Journal, a major American medical journal of science and medicine, decided that it would examine the history of its writings on race and slavery, on Native Americans, on its deep support for eugenics and hereditarian ideas, that in some of which Hitler actually looked to in building the Third Reich. And I and one of my former students, and I love working with my former students, were asked to write an essay on how did the New England Journal cover the Holocaust. And all of my colleagues working on these papers, and this introduces fundamental concepts of digital humanities. You can now search the New England Journal for any term going all the way back to its origins in 1832. So we all were doing these searches. The people working on the slavery issue got hundreds of hits in which slavery was discussed. And when we put in Nazis, Holocaust, Hitler into the digital archive, we got almost no hits at all. Absolute silence. And what we found was that there was no discussion. What does a historian do when there is no archive, when there are no materials to discuss?
The silence of the archives.
Yes, and this is a giant issue that Nadav and I are familiar with, but I'd never seen it in such dramatic form as in the New England Journal of Medicine. And so we asked, well, what were other scientific journals of the time? The journal Science, the Journal of the American Medical Association. And they actually had quite a lot of discussion about what was going on, especially in their early years of Nazi Germany. The New England Journal didn't really mention Nazism between 1933 and 1945 and 6 with the beginning of the Nuremberg trials. So how are we to understand something like that? The silence in the face of one of the most horrendous attacks on human dignity in human history. And, you know, there are ways that people think about this. Well, you know, we're a scientific journal. So, you know, we don't cover politics, or we need to be neutral in some way, or this isn't really relevant to our readership. And our article, which has gotten a lot of media attention, doesn't really fully explain that silence. But I'm really looking forward to teaching this piece, because students will speculate, why didn't the New England Journal, if Science Magazine did, and the Journal of the American Medical Association? And we have to understand the processes of anti-Semitism. How does it work? You know, it's one thing to tell people you shouldn't be anti-Semitic, or it's immoral, or it's unjust. But how does injustice work? What are the processes, the internal processes? And I think there's a lot in the history of health and disease, war and peace. You know, when does empathy fail? That's kind of my project right now. I'm writing a book on stigma. But how do we fail, as, you know, Ron's presentation, to, you know, understand the other, and what are the implications of the kind of anti-Semitism that Katerina Snurbein is trying to assist in reducing and ending. And these are deeply humanistic social science questions. They cross the boundaries of our current organization of knowledge and investigation. And that's another reason why it's been so exciting to be here. There's a sense of excitement, collaboration, future thinking. And I think that learning how things work is a real opportunity in the past to shape the present.
Wow, looking forward for your stigma. We also worked on stigma here in Israel. So you brought the Holocaust, and the Holocaust now re-emerging again and again. There are many discussions, is it appropriate, yes or no? But it's also interesting because the Holocaust, in many ways, it's always written in bioethical textbook that this is the birth of modern bioethics. But then usually it's not mentioned again. We have the Nuremberg trials of physicians. Just recently, Lancet Commission on Nazi Medicine and Medical Education with several Israeli from BGU that participated there, a very important contribution and to think about medical education. So maybe, and this will be probably my final question, what do you think about this remembrance of the Holocaust, maybe the misuse of it, and how it can be reflected in teaching medical students, of course, other health profession. And here I need to say that your work about the interaction between history of medicine and bioethics is one of the most important ones. You edited this volume on Daedalus, Beyond Bioethics, years ago, and I think you were the pioneer here.
Well, I doubt that, but it's a very important question. You know, how do we use the past? For example, how do we use the Holocaust to understand the dynamics of the present? And you know, even without Holocaust denialism, there is a fundamental process of dissociation. And when bioethics was being built, many people in the United States said, you know, we don't need rules and regulations about how to deal with human subjects in our research. That was the Nazis. And so that's just one example of this kind of, can we learn from it or do we distance it? And I think one of the really sobering aspects of the current moment is that it's a reminder that we need to much more deeply teach the lessons of the Holocaust. How did German doctors become so deeply embedded in the medical system of Nazism? How did they do research like this? What if we're asked to do something that doesn't feel right to us? And you and I have taught medical students for years. And what if an attending tells you to, you know, get a tissue sample or go do something or get a specimen or give a drug, and it doesn't feel right to you? And we live in deeply hierarchical systems. We have people who we want to please. How can we resist, you know, certain notions of authority? And these are gigantic philosophical questions. The problem with bioethics, I think, as it emerged, was that it often took away context and said, here are the rules. And what I think a historian with a deep interest in bioethics would say is we need to understand everything around the most powerful bioethical dilemmas. What are the social forces that permit complicity or resist resistance? And how can we learn to express ourselves openly and freely about what we think is right? And that's been a very difficult thing, especially in medical systems that are so powerfully hierarchical. I talk to medical students all the time, and they said, you know, I don't know whether this was racist or not, but the attending told me, or I saw this, and I don't know who to tell about it. And these are dilemmas of our system that we need to understand. And of course, I find myself, you know, quite hopeful about the future. I think we, you know, this kind of work, universities that are dedicated to these kinds of problems can really think about how we close these radical gaps and disparities in health and disease across the world. You know, we have the ability in a university like BGU to think about climate change and how to mitigate it, and it's making people sick right now. This is one of the things, you know, we thought about it as a big policy issue, global warming, but what we're seeing in our clinics is it's making people ill, especially children. So you know, for me, the last best hope is the kind of collective knowledge that universities can produce and the possibility of really translating that knowledge into, you know, an educated public that wants to understand and debate. And that's what I think we try to do.
Wow. So ending with this kind of optimism, but critical and reflective, I want to thank you so much, Professor Allan Brandt, for your leadership, and thank you.